Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Waterfront's latest webinar. We're going to be looking at the current reforms to the NSIP regime and what its future may look like. As I say, I saw the numbers climbing, but from looking at the attendees list, we've got an audience from across the sector covering all the major work streams and all different levels of seniority. And we've got a brilliant panel with experience going right back to the start of the regime to dig into the issues. Awful lot to cover, including new news just this morning. So we will dispense with lengthy introductions. We'll assume you've read our bios online, and suffice to say, we have Liz Dunn, who is a partner at Burgess Salmon, Matt Sharp, a town planner and senior director at Quad. Chris Taylor is head of planning at Progressive Energy, leading on the fascinating HyNet projects. And Lisa Lamb is head of planning and major infrastructure at the National Trust. And finally, I've been promoting NSIPs since Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon first raised its head back in 2011. I will kick off to set the context, then I'll hand over to my colleagues in turn to comment from their perspectives. And given who we've got in the audience, we'll try to keep a good portion of the hour for your questions and comments too. You can chip in with those at any time. We may try to answer some in writing as we go, but the best ones we'll keep for later and get stuck into after everyone's had their say. So the Planning Act's been a stable regime for many years. It's gone through changes of governments, but the only big difference was who made the decisions, with the IPC being ditched in favour of ministers back in 2011. Over 100 DCOs have been consented, 95% approval rates. And for promoters like myself, the NSIP regime, we knew it would be more expensive than the TCPA. We knew it would be resource intensive. But for complex projects, it's given certainty of timescale and a robust consent. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Decisions are frequently delayed and subject to challenge. Costs are rising, along with the skyrocketing page counts of applications. And the regime wasn't designed to cope with the flood of energy and grid projects coming these days with the race to decarbonise and meet energy security. I'd say public sector bodies have also endured years of cuts, and there's just not enough expertise to go around. I think it's fair to say that the regime provided a better and faster consent route for the mega projects, the really big boys, Heathrow, Thames Tideway Tunnel, the nuclear projects and the like. But for more run-of-the-mill projects, the NSIP regime is now arguably longer, more resource intensive than those it replaced. So as we all know, change is afoot. There is a big handful of somewhat overlapping initiatives that are coming through to address policy, process, legislation, all of them aiming to make the regime better, faster, greener, fairer, and more resilient. This is where I could waffle on for ages, but I will keep it as short as I can. There are 5 main areas of forthcoming change that we're going to try to cover: the NSIP Reform Action Plan, the new national policy statements, the National Infrastructure Commission's recommendations on NSIP reforms, environmental outcomes reports, and biodiversity net gain. Now, as I mentioned, these overlap in places. There is a big focus on the pre-application stage. There is a proposed fast-track route to consent. There's a big emphasis on resourcing and cost recovery. And there is a very welcome review into the process for making post-consent changes to DCOs. But there is still a lot of uncertainty in all of this. And before I hand over to my colleagues, I would suggest that many of the problems that we're now facing with these delays and so on are that there is too much caution in the culture surrounding the process now. We're doing multiple consultations, more front loading than was reasonably expected when the regime was initially conceived. Too much is being scoped in. As I mentioned, documents are getting longer and longer. We're getting hundreds of written questions from examining authorities, and decisions are being delayed to ask yet more questions. So Liz, I'll start with your great experience across multiple different DCOs. Do you think caution is one of the major problems that we're facing?
Thanks, Alex, and good morning to everybody. Is caution one of the things we're facing? I think caution has, I think it is an issue for projects. I think that certainly as we see schemes going through the system, we do see caution amongst regulators and decision makers, even in the context where, for example, a particular type of project is quite familiar to in terms of decision making. And I think the changes that are coming through, and to be honest, the lack of implementation of those changes is also making regulators cautious about how they take a view. We have done a project recently with the whole question of offshore biodiversity net gain, which has been raised in the context, obviously, of the BNG reforms, and we've just had the announcement this morning that the BNG reforms, BNG requirement for TCPA applications now is not coming in November as intended. And you know, we've been involved in a project where, even in the context of offshore biodiversity net gain being something of an embryonic thought in somebody's mind, without there being regulation or guidance or even any indication as to what there was, what is required, spending quite a lot of time in DCO examination hearings discussing what offshore biodiversity net gain could be produced by a project when there is no context and the regulators haven't raised that sort of issue. So I think the there's obviously a lot happening in terms of the reforms. There's a lot of suggestions of what is going to happen, how the national policy statements may change, what might happen with environmental outcomes reporting, which is building further requirements for projects to consider issues which may or may not actually come to pass. And I think bringing that uncertainty to regulators in terms of their view of projects. I'm quite heartened to see some of the changes that are being proposed in respect of particularly consultation. It's an area I'm very interested in, and I think the success of pre-application consultation is something that is really important to the DCO regime. It's really important to its credibility and its engagement with local communities and people, as well as with regulators and key statutory bodies. I think we're seeing, with the reforms that are coming through, I think the focus on pre-application consultation, the focus on changing guidance so that actually what is required of promoters is clearer, and where potentially you have changes to schemes, what needs to be done will be very much valued. I think we've reached a position with nationally significant infrastructure projects where it's not what you're trying to achieve with consultation that is the focus, but it's ticking some kind of regulatory box and producing, for example, hundreds or thousands of pages of preliminary environmental information, which is supposed to be the focus of your consultation with local communities, which most of them can't understand, access, or even have much interest in. So I think refocusing consultation on actually, you know, good engagement, looking at what good looks like, what does engagement with your communities and regulators mean. I think that the system has been challenged by lack of consultee engagement and resource. I know I've been involved in DCO since 2008, and right at the outset there was a real push for to get engagement from local authorities, from statutory bodies, and a lot of work was done. I think unfortunately some of that has fallen away with the lack of resourcing amongst statutory bodies and local authorities now, and that then kind of plays into the whole question of caution. I'm really heartened to see within the kind of revised tiering that DLUC have proposed and PINS are looking at around how you get your sort of engagement with PINS, that there is, if you pay for it, potentially up to £200,000 a year, there is the focus on actually working more proactively with the planning inspectorate, taking that role in terms of chairing evidence plans, being involved with statutory bodies, and also the planning inspectorate supporting drawing out that engagement from bodies, which I think will be very important. Equally, the suggestion of that sort of second step, that early stage of consultation adequacy, where the implication seems to be that actually the planning inspectorate will not only be marking the developer's homework in that sense, but they'll also be looking at the engagement that's come from local authorities and statutory bodies as part of that process. So I think some really good things there. Will we move away from caution? I hope so. I hope we move to a system where there is greater confidence and certainty from everybody in the regime. But I think there's a few planks that need to be put back in there. I know Matt's going to talk about policy, but the national policy statements have said this number of years running, but please, can we have revised energy national policy statements in place so that we all know what we're doing and why?
Can I ask one very quick question this before we hand over to Matt on the tiered topic? Do you think promoters will all basically feel obliged to go for the top tier? Can you see any promoters going for the lower tiers?
I think the tiering is really interesting, because actually what it is kind of formalizing the good service you can get from PINs on projects at the moment. So if you have a project and you are engaging with PINs, and I've certainly done projects where they've chaired evidence plan sessions and things like that, they have been incredibly helpful. And I think it's just putting that into a more formalized system. Will everybody want the higher tier? Possibly not. I think what's interesting is that if you want to try and get your project speeded up, so potentially running for less than a 6-month examination, you have to be in tier 3, and tier 3 is supposed to be for the more complex projects. So clearly there's a bit of, give and take on that one. I'd be surprised if anybody wants to put themselves into tier 1, but which is the kind of lowest level of, we'll sort of talk to you twice and actually we're not very interested. But tier 2 and 3 I can see as being something that promoters are interested in. I think it will be for those involved in the process, for us and others advising, to actually be guiding applicants and guiding the people we're working with to say this will actually be of benefit to you. And I think PINs being able to articulate that will be helpful in that context.
Cool. Thank you, Liz. Matt, please share your views.
Cheers, Alex. So I suppose from a sort of planner's perspective, I think we always try and sort of take a couple of steps back. And so, certainly the reforms that have recently been consulted on, they form part of a wider package of measures that are intended to, improve the regime, as you sort of helpfully set out at the start of the webinar. So to achieve those objectives of being, better at delivering robust decisions faster, being more streamlined and a better process, trying to improve outcomes for the environment, and sort of being fairer to communities, and that focus on sort of benefits to those people that may experience impacts, and then also having something that's more resilient. Those all sound like really great initiatives and priorities for the government to have, but it's sort of important to sort of reflect what that really means for us. So I think certainly from my perspective, in terms of those 3 questions that we've been set, so do those reforms, are they expected to improve the process? Is there more that can be done? How can the process be improved? And then how is progress on updating the NPSs going? So with that sort of last question first, this was the government's priority to make sure that there was a clear and up-to-date set of NPSs for all of the relevant sectors. This has been a sort of a consistent sort of point made to government over the last couple of years, and sort of as Liz flagged in her part, that that's a really important part of giving the system certainty. And so this year we've seen some really important moves. So in September, we now have a designated water NPS, which is clearly hugely important for that as a sector, and that's going to give that industry much more certainty in terms of that policy framework that those projects can now come forward in. But we've still got a situation where EN1 and EN3 are in draft. We're hoping that those are going to be designated towards the end of the year. But it's really important that we have clear and up-to-date policy for some of the reasons that you've picked up earlier, because that creates a sort of really clear framework for all parties involved in the process to understand what is the correct policy framework for these projects to be determined against. And having a up-to-date clear set of policies is important for any project, particularly those that are of national significance.
Prime Minister mentioned a possible spatial energy strategy in his various speeches last week.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting suggestion, and it's we've been doing work with a couple of clients involved in that sector, and it's something that we believe, that Quad believe in quite strongly, that would be really beneficial to the sector. I think particularly in terms of some of the spatial constraints that energy has, that a lot of the need arises because of particular need in hotspots on the grid, and there are some clearly spatial constraints on those projects that currently the draft NPS don't sort of give quite as much detail on as you might hope, particularly from a local authority perspective, in understanding why here, why this big, and actually having something of a spatial nature would clearly be beneficial.
Okay, thanks very much, mate. Matt, interesting stuff. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'd certainly agree with what Matt's just been saying there about the energy NPS. I mean, for Progressive as promoters of clean energy projects, you mentioned HyNet and involved in things like peak cluster with decarbonisation of lime and cement industry around the Peak District. Most of our projects are low carbon hydrogen and carbon capture, and the existing NPS documents are, where they do refer to those things, are framed in the context of the last attempt to bring forward carbon capture in this country. So no, they're out of date. They're incredibly confusing when you're talking about the current direction of travel, and in fact, it's just not consistent with government policy that's been published since. So absolutely, those documents are key for us to start developing the future energy system that we need in order to decarbonise. Going back to some of the topics that Liz had highlighted around consultation, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for project promoters at the moment is effective consultation. Clearly, there are questions around where that overlaps with the elements of consultation with regards to communities and getting that right, and indeed, some interesting possible developments on community benefit as well, to make sure communities are getting something from the infrastructure that's being developed in their areas, particularly those parts of the country that are seeing a lot of NSIPs coming through. But I would say the biggest challenge for promoters at the moment is around their engagement with actually government bodies and statutory consultees. As I said, the underfunding of those bodies over the last decade has created huge challenges for them because they simply can't resource the projects. And if we take a step back and think, what are we actually trying to achieve through our planning system? It should be quality development that addresses the effects and impacts of that through good design. And so when we come to actually develop project, or indeed just to take it through that examination determination period, issues should have been resolved along the way. Examination can be and should be relatively straightforward if that front-loading process that should be so key to the DCO regime actually worked. And because of the situation that those consultees find themselves in over recent years, that's just not been possible. We should be able to rely on regular, consistent stakeholder input through that pre-application phase, through the design development of the project, so that we know what the issues are and how to resolve them. I would say even the real basic building blocks of the process at the moment, being able to scope and agree surveys, look at design changes along the way, and develop appropriate mitigation. Those things are not working. So I think what's proposed in the reform is interesting, and it could see an improvement to that. But to me, it does feel like a little bit of a very large sticking plaster over what is fundamentally a badly funded system. We do have at the moment the ability for project promoters to provide funding to those bodies, whether it's through discretionary advice service for bodies like Natural England, or whether it's through PPAs with the local authorities. Those mechanisms are already there. Now, the reforms might allow an expansion of that, and allow promoters to more easily help with the funding required for those bodies to actually fulfil their statutory duties. But one of the problems that we have with the system at the moment, and that mechanism of providing funding, is that it doesn't provide those bodies with a consistency of funding. It comes in lumps and on particular projects. So it's very difficult for bodies to actually have in place the resources they need to be able to attract and retain not just bums on seat, but appropriately skilled and experienced staff who are going to be able to take projects through that development phase. We had issues on a recent examination for one of the HyNet projects where we had issues to resolve at the end of examination with the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales, but for the second week of hearings where those issues were to be discussed, neither had the resources to be able to attend, which made the whole week absolutely farcical from my perspective. Yeah. It's an enormous waste of time, for the promoter, but also for the examining authority. And you could see their frustration with the process, that they're unable to have that discussion that they need to. I think the changes that are proposed in terms of funding, it could certainly help, but it's not the full answer. And I guess the only other sort of caveat that I put on that is that it is potentially a very large increase in costs for some projects. As I said, that could be £200,000 a year just for the planning inspectorate, effectively to be able to fulfil the good job that they do at the moment. And with most DCOs, those are not projects that are taken through pre-application in 12 months typically. It might be, particularly if it's being done well and actually the consultation process is being followed effectively, it might be 2 or 3 years. So you're usually talking, you know, $500,000 plus for just for the planning inspector's role, never mind the others. And, you know, depending on the project, that might create significant problems for developers in terms of, you know, raising that DevEx needed to be able to take projects through. It's an extra challenge, but I think most people will welcome the resources, but it will be an extra issue for projects to contend with as well.
Wow, lots of interesting points there, Chris. Thank you. I'd say two quick things in response to that. First of all, on my last DCO project, one of our local authorities basically failed to participate even with the offer of a planning performance agreement, partly for the resource issues that you indicated. They would rather have a steady income stream to support this work than the lump sums that come from the developers. And secondly, a quick question back to you, really, with all this emphasis on the pre-application phase and the points you made about consultation, I think a lot of developers would feel that they're front loading as much as they can already. You know, there are certain milestones that have to be passed before you can go public. And reaching those milestones takes time, paperwork, more money, and so on. I'm thinking of land deals in place before you want to consult, for example. So how much more front loading is even possible, and would it be worthwhile if if we spend an extra 6 months in pre-application in order to knock 2 months off exam? It's not worth it, is it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And there are sort of conflicting issues here where we do need to try and resolve more issues before it gets to examination, because that's when more time is available without that pressure on people to respond on very short deadlines. It's far easier if it can be dealt with before that. But also on the community side, even the reform consultation suggests that sometimes it is too much already, that communities are being bombarded with information and perhaps unnecessary rounds of consultation where really not much has changed. I think that is a challenge. One thing that I would perhaps add that is maybe a bit of light at the end of the tunnel is actually the changes to the DCO amendment process, because at the moment it's almost essential that your project is clearly enough defined and has enough built-in flexibility that you don't need to make any changes afterwards. Even the non-material change process is far too long, and so that again adds to that risk aversion, being super cautious during the actual pre-application phase. So that's a real positive for me, that we might get some statutory timeframes on that. We have one of the HyNet projects for gas storage being promoted by Innovin. That's fast approaching the 12-month mark for determination of a non-material change, which has no objections raised by anybody. So yes, some timeframes on that would be helpful.
Agreed. Thanks, Chris. Last but not least, Lisa, tongue twister there, sorry, who of course wears various hats in her role, from consultee to landowner.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Really interesting conversation so far, and hopefully just bringing a slightly different perspective from the National Trust as a significant landowner and our engagement through the NSIP regime in a cross-sectoral way. So we have engaged with a number of DCOs across a range of sectors. And I think my opening comments would be that we do see differences. Actually, different sectors approach things differently, and some are good and some are less good, particularly around consultation. consultation. And I think the things that I would highlight there are their willingness to engage and their willingness and ability to share information at an early stage, which is really what people need to engage with the process in a meaningful way. With regard to the proposals, I think from our perspective, there's lots to like. I don't disagree that it could be quicker and simpler and get more certainty. Who wouldn't want that as a matter of principle? Of course, there's lots to like. And I think particularly around consultation, the tiers, that notion of the basic, standard and enhanced, I agree with Liz, it's formalising what's there already in a very clear way. And at best, I really think this could help drive meaningful engagement, actually. And in our experience, again, it's very common, other speakers have talked about this, it's very common to get legally compliant engagement that actually just leaves everybody feeling a little bit shortchanged and can't really see what has changed or the methodology and how things have been worked through. And I think I agree that there is that kind of element of caution. And what I would really, really like to see is proportionality coming back into the process, actually. So the right amount of consultation, the right amount of information, depending on the complexity of those projects. So what about the tiers? Well, at best it could drive more meaningful consultation, but there are some concerns. I agree. I think there is just my mind immediately went to, well, what level is everyone going to go for? And I agree, probably people aren't going to want to be seen to be going for the basic level. Would everybody go for the middle or the top tier? Would people who should go for the more complex things try to go for a lower tier? And I think what this is leading to in terms of our conclusions, that there needs to be some really strong guidance and a framework around this about what level, again, is proportionate. What should applicants and promoters be expected to do? I'd be really delighted if PINs took a more active role actually in the consultation process and were able to drive really good outcomes. And actually that's an expectation that's baked into the system, because I don't think that happens now. I also agree that there is that tension between the fast track and the requirement for the enhanced pre-app level, and not least because probably some of the projects that have got their eye on fast track already in train. So it comes back to the points that others have made. Actually, really, are they going to go for enhanced pre-app and then go on to fast track? Is it really going to be worth their while? I just don't think that kind of lag time has been thought through. I think as well from our perspective, it'd be really great. What I would really love to see is good engagement and meaningful outcomes being incentivised through the pre-app process and those tiers. So that ability to move to a lower tier if you're really resolving the issues and really removing the challenge, to actually have a lower level and a shorter examination, of course. I think though we shouldn't overlook the absolute critical role that good consultation and engagement plays. It's absolutely critical to the credibility of this whole regime, and notwithstanding that these projects are by nature in the national interest, they do affect local communities, and so it's absolutely, it goes to the heart of good planning and a robust process, in our view. So it's absolutely critical that we get that right. I agree with others as well. At the moment, this lack of proportionality, cautionary approach is leading to an overload of information, and it's not all good information. More rounds of consultation doesn't equal good consultation, it's just more information. So I would really welcome a streamlining there. Others have touched on this, but I don't think I could finish without sharing some reflections around skills, resources and training. All of the topics that have been discussed will demand well-resourced organisations across the regime, actually. So from PINs, local authorities, consultants who are supporting developers and promoters, and of course the statutory consultees. We also have experience of a real lack of ability, particularly around consultees, to engage in that process. And I think that does undermine credibility when the experts in those particular areas can't show up to inquiry and actually give some technical support. I think that's a sorry state of affairs. But I agree, it's more than numbers. What we need is that those experienced practitioners that can really face into those challenging scenarios and make really confident but difficult decisions. And that's not about numbers, that's about experience and knowledge of the process. And again, I see this at every level, from, you know, statutory context, but I've also had scenarios where in inquiries, you know, inspectors don't seem to know the case. You know, they're not able to chair effectively, you know, running over time, the questions are poorly framed. That doesn't help the process either. So I think that there is actually, I would say there is a resource and skills crisis, actually, not only in the NSIP regime, but across the planning regimes. And I actually don't think that is an overstatement. And I think it has actually genuinely got to be tackled if these reforms are to be a success, as we all want them to be. There's a legacy piece here as well. This isn't new. We've been living with it for a while. And I think as well, it plays into Liz's point about the scale of change, actually. With everything feeling so uncertain, you can't have those experienced practitioners because it's all new, actually. How is it going to shake out? How is it going to work out? What is case law going to look like? So to my mind, I think a lot of the changes that are coming through are trying to get the system working how it did when it was originally introduced, in the face of well-resourced local authorities, confident decision making, clear parameters, clear guidance from PINs, which seems to have been lost along the way.
Agreed.
So I'll pick there.
Yeah, I made my own note that a lot of this is just about making the regime work as originally intended, and that some of the changes being proposed are untested, where the original regime did actually work quite well. You know, applicants were always required to front load and resolve issues before submission. Applications were always supposed to be proportionate. Exams were always supposed to be a maximum of 6 months and could be less. The NPSs were always supposed to be updated every 5 years. The public sector was always supposed to be properly resourced. So, you know, we just need to go back to where we were. And so that, again, taking us back to a point I think we've all touched on earlier, it's perhaps a cultural change that's required rather than you know, legislative and so on. And then we've had a bunch of we're starting to get some questions coming in. We've had some excellent contributions from the 4 panel members. I hope you agree. Do get more questions coming in. We've had 2 questions from Alistair Krapp from LDA Design, and Liz has wants to jump on the first one. So I'll hand back to you, Liz.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Alistair, for your question. I think you're right. It's about, I think the thing that disappoints me about consultation and where the NSIP regime has got to is there seems to be too much focus on the statutory consultation element. So the bit where you produce your peer and you say effectively, this is our application and this is what we're going to be doing. What do you think about it? Then those earlier stages where through non-statutory consultation, informal engagement, you can really talk to communities, to local authorities, to other regulators about what your scheme could be, what the options are, how you think about the things that are important to communities, where you've set some parameters around actually what you can provide in addition to your project. You manage some expectations around those elements and you really find out what matters to communities. I think perhaps we've reached a situation where the balance isn't correct, in that there's far too much focus on the peer. I mean, preliminary environmental reports are thousands of pages long now, often of very impenetrable information, and you're pretty far down the process, as opposed to being at those earlier stages where actually you can sort of engage with local communities properly. And I think there is some messaging that is important around that. And Alex mentioned a scheme that we were both involved in. Local authorities understanding that actually when there is non-statutory consultation or engagement, it's their opportunity to shape a project. It's their opportunity to raise issues, to raise concerns about projects, to start to really get into the detail of these are the things that we will need to see to happen if we're to be comfortable with this. These are our issues. And I think it probably comes back to that first point you made, Alex, around people around a sort of lack of confidence of those engaging in the regime to actually say, this is our issue. We don't need to worry about that. This is our issue. These are the things that we need to focus on. And then the regime and developers and applications actually being able to engage with those and move forward with them. So yes, Alistair, absolutely agree. And I really hope through these reforms with the changes in guidance that there's actually more emphasis put on the non-statutory part of NSIP consultation and engagement, because I think that's the bit where you can really start to create and develop relationships and engage with local communities and local authorities.
Thanks, Liz. Next, we've had a great question from Tom Carpen. It's a while since we've spoken, Tom, but I'm assuming you're still fulfilling your role in leading these changes in project speed and so on. So he's asked the panel for further specific views on how to make pre-application more effective without lengthening the time it takes. Matt wants to answer that question, but I also want to hear from Chris on that, given his role at the moment. So perhaps Matt go first and then Chris.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. I think it's a really good question, because I think the point that Chris had raised in his section was really well made, just in terms of what more can we do in terms of front loading the process. I suppose one of the really interesting parts of the reform consultation that caught my eye is the ability of those proposed changes to include inspectors that could then be involved as part of the examination to actually give pre-app advice. And I think that sort of feels like a really important opportunity for projects to make much more effective pre-app engagement, because I think using that pre-app advice to help give clarity on areas of potential disagreement on projects could really help make that pre-app stage much more effective, because it gives a more independent view on issues. It would help steer potential disagreement between local authorities and promoters on potential policy interpretation, making sure that promoters have got a clear understanding of what is likely to be a principal matter for the examination. So certainly from my perspective, that feels like a small but really important change to that pre-app process. So that was one of the sort of changes in the consultation I was sort of more excited about.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Chris?
Yeah, certainly. I think Matt makes some excellent points there around that PIN's involvement during the process, and help in terms of resolving issues between parties before it gets to examination. I think that might be incredibly valuable. And I'd also take that role for PINs, or the importance of that role for PINs further back in the process as well, in terms of their role in the scoping of work at the start, whether that's in terms of for example any input in terms of suitable amount of consultation with communities, but also scoping of environmental assessment, where I feel that risk aversion has been very high over recent years, and increasingly so, and that leads to the frankly astonishing number of documents that are being prepared, and the number of words written at both the peer stage, as Liz has highlighted, and when it comes to the application itself. If we can actually empower the people involved, we can empower PINs to be less risk averse, and right at the outset of the process say what are the principal issues here, not just principal issues for examination at the end, but right at the start of the process. What are basic issues that are managed through good practice and really shouldn't be a topic for debate for the 2 years of pre-app and 18 months of post application. What is just fundamental good practice when you're building something, and what are the things that we really need to focus on here? Where are there the risks of significant effects on the environment? Where have we got issues that are going to affect communities? And if we can actually focus everybody's attention on those at the outset, not only will we get a more streamlined process, but I think we'll get better outcomes as well, because we'll be putting our resources and focus on the things that matter.
You mentioned PINs being empowered to make those calls. Of course, the examining authorities always have been. Do you think they're doing so adequately?
It's an interesting one when it comes to the examination itself. I think there's always a very difficult balance to be struck between giving everybody a reasonable voice through that process and the ability to raise issues that they feel are important to them. But I think sometimes examining authorities could be clearer in terms of shutting down issues that are not relevant to the examination and the project that's before them, or indeed to perhaps unreasonable or vexatious statements that are being made and perhaps not challenged sufficiently. I think the format of examination is a much more democratic one, but the absence of cross-examination in that process really does put the responsibility on the planning inspectors to challenge statements where they are not being evidenced or are perhaps unreasonable. And it is a challenging job for them because they cannot be experts in everything, and when they're taking evidence from technical specialists, it's very difficult for them to challenge effectively where things are perhaps not correct or not being explained properly. So I think it's a hard job for them, but perhaps the increase in resourcing that's been talked about in the reform document, and increase in training, and hopefully bringing through that process will allow the new planning inspectors to be supported by more experienced colleagues. Hopefully that allows them to do that.
Cool, thank you, Chris. I can't resist Tom Carpen's follow-up question there as well. Any views on the fast track quality standard? I mean, we've already touched on this tension between the fast track being expected to be suitable for simpler projects, and yet the fast track being tier 3, £200,000 gamble on a 2-month saving on exam. Who'd like to jump on that, Liz?
I'll jump on that one. It's an interesting. I'm interested that the planning inspectorate's highlighted that, because it had always been the case that with effectively the planning inspectorate being able to accept or decline applications for examination, that they were supposed to all be of a quality standard that would take you through to examination. So I'd be very interested to understand what more it is that is the expectation around that quality standard for applications to then meet the fast track and go through, given that we're all supposed to be in a position where the applications that are submitted are, as far as possible, ready to go through examination. So is there a higher expectation? And I think that probably then feeds right back into everything we've been talking about consultation and engagement around actually what the expectation is around that higher quality standard, and being absolutely clear where as to what PIN sees as being the things that are are causing longer, causing examinations to be longer and take more time, given the people involved generally in this process and the quality of applications for nationally significant infrastructure projects, I would say, are the highest quality of applications for planning that we see across the country. So I'd be interested from PINS to know, or from DLUC to know what it is that is, would be the expectation around that higher level of quality.
Cool. Thank you. I'd love to ask the rest of the panel their views on that as well, but I'd also like to get on to Kirsty Lodge's question, Chris, which is a good one and particularly relevant given that it relates to news that was only announced last week.
Yes, so this is relating to the plans for a spatial strategy for energy, and I think that there's certainly a lot of merit in this. What I would say on that is that it does need to be a balance and not preclude other projects from coming forward. And I think perhaps some careful thought from government about what's included within that spatial strategy, because there are clearly some things within our energy mix which are perhaps driving that proposal from the government for a spatial strategy. I'm thinking, for example, electricity transmission, where we clearly have large numbers of what will be very controversial projects coming forward that are absolutely needed in terms of decarbonising our electricity system. And those need to go where they need to go. And so having clear policy support for that may well be helpful. On the flip side of that, I would say there's also, with frankly a revolution in our energy system, the way we use energy coming over the next couple of decades, and even over the next 5 to 10 years. Many of the projects that are being taken forward are industry-led and come from industry innovation, not from top-down government. They come from companies and organisations coming together, seeing an opportunity and seizing that opportunity. I think a spatial strategy that really precludes that from happening would stifle that innovation, and we need to be mindful that we don't stop that from happening. This is the energy system is going to go through a period of very rapid change, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say that perhaps government's ability to keep up with that rate of change is maybe not there. I'd submit the evidence of the current energy NPS as evidence of that. What we put in a spatial strategy now may be entirely inappropriate in another 5 to 10 years' time. And is that spatial strategy going to be updated regularly enough to be able to keep up with that?
Thank you, Chris. I've got a question of my own, given your mention of energy. I think we mentioned at the top of the webinar that many of the problems being faced by the regime are spinning off from the huge number of energy and grid related projects clogging up the system, so to speak. If all the changes are implemented and go as well as we could possibly imagine, do any of you think it's enough to address the scale and urgency of the climate, energy and biodiversity crises that we're facing? Is this the regime that you would use to save the planet?
I think you've got to nominate somebody, Alex.
I thought, well, Matt was first to unmute.
Matt was
so
first
kind
to
of waiting
unmute. Go on, Matt.
Apologies for the quiet patch.
I I don't think it's a million miles away from the regime that you would want. I think the point that often gets missed and is probably missing from the current set of reforms is that sort of refocus on, what do you need, defining what nationally significant projects are. They are the most urgent projects needed to meet those really important objectives. And I think that sort of urgency point often gets sort of demoted in the sort of pecking order of issues, because actually, if we are really committed to delivering net zero, then a lot of the conversations about delay, particularly in that pre-app phase, should be put into context to say this project is needed. Discussions about why here, why so big, particularly with some of the sort of solar projects, should be put into that context to say, these are needed. It needs to be this big. It needs to be in this location for these, quite straightforward, practical reasons. And having more clarity on that would make the regime work more effectively and be quicker, fairer, and more proportionate. But it's sort of losing the context of what does nationally significant really mean? What does an urgent project really mean? And to make sure that everybody involved in the process recognise that that is the priority.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Do you put your hand up for Elena's question as well? And we've got another sort of couple of minutes left. Were there anything specific you wanted to mention on that, Matt?
I think it's a sort of similar point, really, in terms of how do you make that sort of engagement with stat consultees in the pre-app stage more effective. It's I think Liz mentioned it sort of in her section, which is how do you make some of the StatCon material more relevant to people, giving people information that's proportionate for what they're interested in, because not often a draft ES isn't necessarily the most effective way of resolving people's legitimate interest in a project. So you get more effective engagement if you give people information that reflects what they're interested in, and that is going to be different depending on who you talk to, but it's that cautious approach that we've all mentioned is causing problems, because being legally compliant ends up being a draft ES that gets consulted on, and that isn't the most effective way of bringing people with you. If you look at TCPA consultation, that happens in a much different way and arguably much more effectively to focus on issues that people are genuinely interested in. And so you obviously need something that's transparent and fair, but overloading people with a draft ES feels like a an unsatisfactory solution. Yeah,
I see your point. Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I think I did want to hand to Lisa on Alistair Kratt's design question, but I think we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. So sorry to leave you out there, Lisa, but I found that discussion fascinating. I hope all the rest of you have as well. It's very hard to pull out any conclusions from that. There is so much change to keep on top of. We've got to look ahead to anticipate what will be in place when we submit as applicants. But that uncertainty applies to everyone involved in this. The emphasis on the pre-application stage is both well warranted and slightly daunting when we're already doing so much work in that direction, I think. And I'd say, we've touched on the need for cultural change quite extensively in addition to these bigger legislative changes. If you're anything like me, you will watch the legal planning blogs to learn more about this as things change. And of course, do check Waterfront's website and your emails for more webinars like this. Maybe we'll be back after a new government is in place to have this conversation again, to just talk about a whole new range of changes to the regime. Also, Waterfront's usual conference, the NSIP Forum 2024, 6th and 7th of March in London next year, just being launched. So keep an eye on your emails for that. Thank you to the audience for their questions. Sorry to any we didn't get to answer, and thank you to all of the panel for their expertise. I hope you all found this useful.